Good evening, everybody. My name is Wayne Ranney, and I serve on the board of directors for the Grand Canyon Historical Society. And we welcome you to tonight's virtual outing. The Grand Canyon Historical Society, our mission is to celebrate and promote the study and preservation of the Grand Canyon region's cultural and natural history for the education and enjoyment of its members and the public. And just last year in 2024, we celebrated 40 years of existence when the society was started by some pioneer members of Grand Canyon Village. We encourage you to become a member. Our dues are only $35 a year. We are an all-volunteer organization, and we're hopeful that many of you can join us so that we can continue to expand all of our activities like these virtual outings and in-person outings and our tri-annual history symposiums. If you do become a member, you'll get 4 issues in the calendar year of the Old Pioneer magazine, which has a lot of history articles about the Grand Canyon and the Grand Canyon region. So we do these virtual outings. We conduct tours at the South and North Rim, and you can find it on our website. Our website is very easy, grandcanyonhistory.org.
Tonight, we're really honored to have Cindy Stafford present to us the Powell women out of the shadows. And before Cindy begins, I want to give her a brief introduction. Cindy lives in Page, Arizona, and worked for the National Park Service for 10 years as a seasonal interpretive ranger at Glen Canyon National Recreation Area. She volunteers in the off-season for the Cultural Resources Division there of the recreation area. I've worked with her there. She's very, very helpful, very knowledgeable, very professional. She and her husband are amazing historians. Cindy's love of canyon country and its history began with a mini Grand Circle vacation in 1989 and led to hiking, camping, explorations, and living in Utah and Arizona with her husband, Kern. In 2015, Cindy published a walking tour map of the Grand Canyon Cemetery and provided research for her husband's book, In a Better Place, Cemeteries and Grave Sites of Grand Canyon. In a previous life, Cindy completed her master's degree in communicative disorders at the University of New Mexico and worked for 15 years in that field in New Mexico, Utah, Washington, and Arizona.
We all know that John Wesley Powell's legacy overshadows that of everyone in his family, including these 4 women: his wife, Emma, his daughter, Mary, his sister, Nell, and his niece, Maud. And we're going to start looking at some of the challenges these women faced and the accomplishments that they had in their lives, and starting with Emma. And most of these people seem to go by a name other than their first name. So I'm going to use the names they went by. And Emma goes by Emma, and John Wesley Powell was known as Wes to his family. They were half cousins, not full cousins, as is often reported. They married in 1861 in Detroit, and for their honeymoon, they went south to the Civil War. Emma followed him to the south. And you're probably familiar with the Battle of Shiloh circled there on that Union Army map in blue. And it was at Pittsburgh Landing. It's where Powell lost his right arm, and Emma helped nurse him through that. They sent him to Chicago after that to recuperate. And also, I think he worked as a recruiter to get more people to sign up for the Union Army. He credited Emma with him being able to return to the Civil War and fight out the rest of the war. And she followed him from site to site. Grant would often ride with Powell back maybe 8 miles to where their wives were staying at a headquarters while they were preparing for their battles and spend the night there. They also retreated to Detroit for a second surgery on his arm. He continued to have pain in that arm for the rest of his life, and later in life even had a 3rd surgery. But at the end of the war, instead of staying with the Army, he wanted to return to teaching geology and went back to Bloomington, Illinois. In this 1951 Denver Post article, they say that Emma was the major's right-hand woman. She was fighting a war see if I can move this. Climbing a mountain, it made no difference to Emma. She stayed close to her man. And apparently the hairstyle is what she looked like in the rip-roaring 60s. That would be the 1860s. She accompanied Wes and his students in 1867 to the West. That took 40 days by wagon to go over the plains and get to Denver. And from there, they went out to many different locations. She climbed Pikes Peak with a group of 7 or so students in Wes. They had to overnight after a horseback ride and a snowstorm. And even some of the male students did not go on that hike. She worked as an assistant ornithologist, and it was more than just a title. She actually taxidermied 175 birds for various museums back east. The following summer, she also went west with the students in West by train this time to Wyoming. Then they took a stagecoach, traveled 100 miles on Mexican ponies, and they spent the winter in northwestern Colorado in a cabin that they built themselves. And very few overwintered, and she was the only woman to stay the winter there. And she helped collect Ute vocabulary while they were there. You probably know that both of Powell's expedition boats were named for her, the Emma Dean. And she refused to believe the reports early on in the first trip, 1869, that the party had been lost in the Green River. Andy Hall wrote in his journal at the end of the trip, "We'd all been reported drowned by some lying scoundrel." But she published a letter in the newspaper discounting these unreliable reports, and she had received a letter from Wes, and she knew that the party had made it that far. And the 1871 trip where these photos are taken from, both women, Emma and her sister-in-law Nell, accompanied their husbands. A.H. Thompson was on that expedition, Nell's husband. And the women spent the summer in Salt Lake City at the Salt Lake House. And it said the ladies will probably make Salt Lake their residence during the summer months. Well, Emma was 5 months pregnant, so they stayed the whole summer in the fall, and she gave birth to a baby September 8th, by my reckoning, with this newspaper account. And I can't remember what else. Oh, they'd been married almost 10 years, and that was their only child, a daughter, named for Wes's mother, Mary Dean. The baby was about 6 months old, or I'm sorry, 6 weeks old before the father made it there to see her. But Wes left the expedition, that second expedition, a couple of times to go to Salt Lake and see Emma, who was apparently having a difficult pregnancy. Hillers wrote in his journal that they stayed in the city for a couple weeks. They purchased animals and wagons, and they brought Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Powell back with them to the camp that was located outside of Kanab, Utah, a pioneer town that was founded just the year before. And they also brought a Mormon nursemaid who apparently cheered the survey team. This was the 1871 trip, and the woman on the right's believed to be Nell. I put this photo here because these tent houses are what the women lived in, and the baby Mary lived in a clothes basket, or slept in one, for the first few months of her life. The men were there. Excuse me. This, I think, looks very much like Harry Thompson, Nell's husband. And I wonder if one of these three is Fred Dellenbaugh, or if you looked at some of the expedition photos from the second trip, maybe you could match some of those photos. But the survey team was creating a 9-mile baseline from Kanab, where this monument is located, south, and then shooting all these target points and putting up these monuments to triangulate from. So it says here that they raised a tent and housed a telescope, by which means the meridian was established during the winter of 1872 and 1873, and they made their map from that. If you haven't seen that monument in Kanab, it's worth going to see. It's been moved a block to the east, I think, and it's got some inaccuracies on it. You can go look at it. The women provided some evening entertainment by leading in the song singing, and they made plum pudding for Christmas that year. Emma and Wes and the baby made their way by stagecoach back to Salt Lake City in early February, and then east to Washington, D.C. by train. They purchased this home at 910 M Street, since been torn down, but 3 stories, had lots of room. He had an office. They were part of the social and musical circles of the city. There were lectures every night. It was very much the club era. The National Geographic Society and the Cosmos Club were hatched in their living room. Emma shows up in the newspaper as one of the women who served science, and she's in the Women's Anthropological Society. They said that Mrs. Powell spent 8 happy summers with the survey party. I can only count 3 summers that she was in the West and not all with the survey party. That she had a number of anthropological specimens, maybe. Usually they were listed in the husband's names. They mentioned her Pikes Peak climb. Over winter in the cabin in Colorado, they had 3 books in their library: the Bible, Shakespeare, and Nicholas Nickleby. They mentioned that she always had great receptions at her house with music, essays, or something for the cultivated taste. And she did keep her hand in nursing by being on the hospital board, which was a training school for nurses at the Garfield Hospital. She was a founding member of the Wimedosses Club, that stands for Wives, Mothers, Daughters, and Sisters. They were a progressive organization. They worked for women's suffrage, and they promoted education of the mind, body, and soul. They had a gymnasium eventually, and they had educational classes like secretarial training for women. The family spent about 6 summers in Brooklyn, Maine, and in Haven, Maine nearby. This is west of Acadia National Park, is where John Wesley Powell died in 1902 after suffering a stroke. And he was buried in Arlington. Emma survived him by 22 years, and she's buried there with him. This is historian Robert Olson on the left at the monument of the grave. And he was a historian at Pipe Spring National Monument, and he wrote an article about the baseline survey, and it's published in the Utah Historical Society. And on the right is what it looked like a few years ago when I managed to find it. It's of interest, at Emma's funeral, one of her pallbearers was Dr. David White. He did a lot of work in the Grand Canyon as a paleobotanist, geologist, and he was one of her pallbearers. He and his wife are buried in the Grand Canyon Cemetery. In addition to those 2 boats that were named for her, there's a Powell survey point west of Toroweep on the north side of the canyon called Mount Emma. It's a horrible hike to get to it, but it's fun to locate. You have to bushwhack quite a ways. And if it's hot and you want to take your outer shirt off and tuck it in your pack, when you get back to your truck, you won't be able to find it because the shrubs have torn it off. Leave no trace, right? This is the 20th anniversary of a 1913 parade that this banner for Emma Dean Powell was carried. And by a descendant, I can imagine that would have been Mary. But the parade was held on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's first inauguration to try to really force the issue of women getting the right to vote. A crater on Mars is named for her. And our Glen Canyon Conservancy sells the Emma Bean coffee. Now we'll look at the younger sister. She was 6 years younger than Wes. Ellen Luella, she went by Nell, and she married her college sweetheart, Harry Thompson. He was Powell's friend and second in charge on that expedition and did a lot of the mapping and topography work. Nell had worked as a school teacher from the age of 16, and when Harry entered the Civil War right after they got married, she worked as a sub at the superintendent of schools, which was his job. She had something to do with the Illinois Natural History Society. I have a feeling they kind of mixed her up with what Wes was doing there, but maybe they were all contributing specimens for it. And in 1863, she nursed Civil War soldiers as well. She spent at least 6 summers in the West from 1867 on, and she was often with her husband on those surveys. In the 1870 census, 7 of the family members were living in the same household, and that included Harry Thompson and Nell, his nephew, his mom, the brother-in-law, Wes and Emma, and even the younger brother, Walter Powell, was living there. Men were working as school teachers. It's fun to speculate, but there's no evidence that Nell and Emma went to this meeting with Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the left and Susan B. Anthony on the right. It's the National Women's Suffrage Association. Susan's diary is with the Library of Congress, and she wrote that Mrs. Stanton spoke to 400 or 500 on the 29th of June. And then the following night, Mrs. Stanton had a large meeting of women in the old tabernacle, and I spoke to a very small house. So whether or not Emma and Nell or either one of them went to this meeting, we know that they were interested in women's suffrage because they published this in the newspaper. This was the American Women's Suffrage Association, headed by Lucy Stone. They were holding a lecture there and inviting people to it. And they said that this was the conservative body of suffragists. They deprecate the loose views of the National Suffrage Association. Victoria Woodhull, that hussy. And so if you don't know Victoria Woodhull, you'll have to look her up because she ran for president in 1872, and she argued that the 15th Amendment said citizens could vote and women were citizens. Well, that was argued by some. But here's a map that shows where the 1872 and 1873 winter headquarters were, and that we've seen this photo before of the tent house and the crew. In the top of the map, you can see that, maybe you can see that Jacob Hamlin's ranch is up there, and there's a cave with Dellenbaugh's name. But the camp is located just south of the Utah-Arizona line near Highway 89 to the west of it, and north of Fredonia. Cousin Clem Powell was on that 1872 trip, and he wrote that Nell accompanied the professor, that's what they called Harry Thompson, professor or prof, being desirous of making botanical collections and inspired by a love of adventure. Oh, and her little dog, Fuzz, was along too. Here's one of the maps that they made. And when Powell and Emma were in Salt Lake City before going back east in 1872, he talked to the newspapers and told them they were establishing this Meridian base from Kanab south, erecting monuments on the conspicuous points 100 miles in every direction. And you might notice this at Brow Monument. If you go there, you'll see this kind of diagram. It's been published as well. The baseline's at the top in red. That's that 9-mile baseline, and all the high points with Powell survey points are listed there. Emma is here and on the map to the left. And at the bottom, if you can read this, you'll recognize some of these names: Thompson, Bishop, Dellenbaugh, and Jones. Ellen wrote in a journal on this 5-week horseback trip she took with the survey party, "I never felt more exultant in my life. I was looking on the most wonderful scenery I ever beheld." Mount Ellen in the Henry Mountains at the top of the map is named for her. And the little locations that are oblong, if you can see those, it's where she botanized, where she collected plants and pressed them. She had a couple botany texts with her, and she was collecting plants for Asa Gray at the Harvard Herbarium. He was the most well-known botanist of the 19th century, and he published his manual and updated it several times. And she would send him pressed specimens from the field every 3 months. You probably can't see these little purple flowers on the upper right of the pressed diagram on the left, but here's a larger photo on the right, and it's a plant that was named for her. And I think 5 plants were named for her altogether, and maybe 15 of her plants were actually new and not known to science before. On the bottom is one of her field collection lists. She collected 385 specimens. That's not all that many for botanical collectors, but she had very unusual field conditions. That 5-week trip they were on, most people were sick and maybe they had bad water, and they had snowstorms they were dealing with. When she got back, she wrote in her journal, "I feel used up more so than I have ever felt in my life." Bishop, who helped collect some plants for her, said, "Mrs. T looks careworn and thin." And Dellenbaugh, ever the optimist, said she was the most cheerful and resolute explorer of the whole company. I'm not sure how used up she really was, because she rested one day at the headquarters camp and then rode a horse 14 miles to Johnson Canyon, overnighted, and rode 14 miles back the next day. And here's Harry on his horse ute on one of the surveys. William Henry Jackson painted this scene from the Lee's Ferry area of the Powell survey. And Nellie Powell is thought to be the woman sketching in the foreground here. She liked to sketch botanical specimens. This is not one of hers. I couldn't find one that she had that's published or digitized. She's the first non-native woman believed to ride a boat through the Paria Riffle at Lee's Ferry, and the men rowed her upstream in Glen Canyon. She declared the scenery marvelous, and she wished that she could go down canyon through the rapids with the men. Nell and Harry owned a ranch, a sheep ranch in Kansas for a number of years. He named the area Ivanpah. It's a Paiute word, I think it means clear water, and there's a historic schoolhouse that still it remains. In 1880, Harry got a full-time job with the U.S. Geological Survey, thanks to his brother-in-law in DC, but he still had a lot of dealings in Kansas, and I think Nell lived there and maybe worked as a postmistress for a while. He co-founded the Kansas Academy of Science in 1883, and he worked as the chief geographer on a Kansas survey. And the oldest Powell sister, Martha, lived in Kansas. She was married to a congressman, and she's the mother of Arthur Powell Davis, later director of the Bureau of Reclamation. Nell was a director of the Women's Anthropological Society that was founded in 1896. And those two women's organizations eventually unified into the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Nell was the president of the District of Columbia Women, and she was a friend of Susan B. Anthony's and helped plan the 80th birthday celebration in 1900 for her. She gave a talk. It says here that she read an exhaustive report of the work in DC, and it was mostly philanthropic because nobody has a vote in the district. And that was true, I think, until the 1964 presidential election. Miss Anthony said the women of the district have one great consolation. They are on exact political equality with the men. At the time, only 4 states in the West had women's suffrage. That was Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho. The tallest peak in the Henry Mountains is named for Ellen. Here it is on the map on the left. And the only piece of a Powell expedition boat that remains is the Nellie Powell, and it's in the Grand Canyon Museum collection. Harry died in 1906, and he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Nell joined him 5 years later. Her epitaph reads, "She hath done what she could." It comes from a verse in the book of Mark. The rest of it is, "She has come aforehand to anoint my body to the burying." It was still another 9 years before women got the right to vote. Now we'll look at Mary Dean Powell. We've mentioned she was born in Salt Lake City. She's age 4 on the left. Looks pretty adorable. She was adored. She was an only child, and she said later in life that she was very spoiled. The photo on the right is unidentified except for female relative of Powell, but I think it's probably a teenage Mary. She shows up in the newspaper. She's 21 with a bunch of other young women from the Capitol as a woman of helping her father with science. It reads like a singles ad. She's tall and graceful, and she's got flashing black eyes. She's kind of shy. She speaks fluent German and French, and she practices piano half the day, and she's part of the musical clique of the city, and she made her formal bow to society the previous year. There's never any mention of a suitor, and she remains single and no children. But here she is going to Europe with her mother and some friends, and on the upper right, she's attending the new Cochrane Art Gallery with her father. It's a National Geographic Society event. And President Bell, that's Alexander Graham Bell, he was a personal friend of the family. Her parents held a reception in 1897 at the swanky brand new Shoreham Hotel, and they described the decor and what the women were wearing. Mary was daintily dressed in pale pink silk and chiffon. In 1902, Worcester writes that Mary was stricken by a nervous illness. Her mother took her to France, and that her father's first stroke that happened earlier in January of that year, the doctors feared might push her over the edge. Wouldn't you love to know more about that? She apparently came back with her mother, and they brought the body back to Washington and had a couple services, and you might recognize Hillers and W.H. Holmes as two of the pallbearers for John Wesley Powell. He was buried at Arlington. The women couldn't afford that nice house anymore without his salary. I think Emma lived on a pension of $50 a month, his pension. They lived in these two censuses that were taken in 1910 and 1920 in the on Oregon Street in the Concord Apartments. Mary's listed as having her own income. Don't know much about that. And there's lots of gaps in these women's lives that's not documented. Donald Worcester writes that Mary cut no figure at all in the world. She lived quietly at home. She suffered recurrent illnesses, and she never married or took up a career. Poor thing. The end. Yeah, it sounds very dismissive to me. But she shows up in 1937, the 20th anniversary of one of the silent sentinels from the White House that was thrown in jail for protesting wanting women's right to vote. These women were given the Freedom Pin. I don't know if you can see this. I'll show you at the end. I'm wearing one. You can buy these from the Alice Paul Institute. They were awarded these having served time in jail as a medal, like they had served in a battle. And 168 out of the 500 active pickets were thrown in jail. They were arrested for obstructing traffic, and they wanted to be treated as political prisoners. It also mentions in this 1937 article that a drive for the passage of an Equal Rights Amendment is being planned. Well, we know how that's worked out. So Alice Paul re-energized the women's suffrage movement, and she formed the National Women's Party. Mary was listed as a founding member of this. I don't know if she attended this meeting or the founding of it in the June of 1916, but they planned this coast-to-coast train trip. They called their car the Suffrage Special. They ended up in Chicago to form the party, but they went to, even stopped at Williams and the Grand Canyon and had a little event at El Tovar. And this poster shows by 1916 how many states in the West had full suffrage for women. I like this line at the bottom that says, "How long will the Republic of the United States lag behind the monarchy of Canada?" Trying to shame the United States into giving women the right to vote. This was going to be the second term for Wilson, and the Women's Party had one plank to get women the right to vote. And they really put a lot of pressure on the president. And that's why they were protesting, the first group to ever protest at the White House. It was the buildup to World War I, and it was seen as being very unpatriotic, even though they only carried banners. But their banners were ripped. Sometimes they were verbally and physically assaulted. And I mentioned their arrests. They were thrown in jail, some of them. The leaders went on a hunger strike, and they were force-fed. Finally, the public and politicians couldn't stand that. And here's one more. Alice Paul holding Kaiser Wilson. 20 million women, rather, are not self-governed in America. They're really upping the pressure on Wilson. They're dressed in white. They're across the street at Lafayette Square. They're burning his speeches that talk about democracy. They're trying to point out how hypocritical this is. Now, Wilson believed that women should have the right to vote, but he just thought it should go state by state. Let's not make anything too drastic like a national amendment. But eventually 36 states did ratify it, and Secretary of State signed it into law in August of 1920, and Mary Dean Powell was at that meeting. Here she is, 1922, at an equal rights conference. She's got this rather severe, stern look always. Dellenbaugh had written to her asking if she had any of her parents' journals, and she said she didn't. Her mother didn't have good memory anymore. My mother's now a confirmed invalid. I lead a busy life taking care of her and keeping house. For diversion, I have frequent wrangles with the landlord and the laundress. And she took a train trip, this is after Emma died, to the West. Sorry, my mouse is being erratic here. She must have attended Emery Cold's lecture and movie, and she said, before I reached my journey's end, she was in Chicago on their way back. I can't see this. I gotta move this. I wish to thank you for your great courtesy and tell you how much I enjoyed your lecture. Your treatment was in striking contrast to that which I received at the hotel. And then the very next day, she writes again, this is from the Drake Hotel in Chicago. She says, in my reference to the treatment at the hotel at the Canyon, I did not make it clear that I consider I was treated with the greatest insolence. And then she goes on to describe more, and she eventually says, you will be amused to learn that I paid $17 for a drive of 35 minutes. I think this was a Harvey tour of the rim out to Hermit's Rest and back, if that was there then. But anyway, along that West Rim Drive. And her writing is really hard to read, and she's got it folded, and she writes up on the side sometimes. So when the men question me and sentimentalize about the monument, as they always do, I shall reply that I think no monument and better manners would draw more people to the canyon. And the monument she's talking about, of course, is the monument to her father, Powell Monument, that went up in 1918. This is taken right from the Park Service. The plaque at the top of the stairs commemorates Powell, the men who joined him, not the three who left at Separation Canyon, on his 2 trips down the Green and Colorado rivers through the canyon, and also commemorates the 50th and 75th anniversaries of Grand Canyon National Park. Dellenbaugh wrote, the seat feature was omitted entirely. Its cost was beyond the funds available. Well, that seat was the chair that was on top of his boat, and they were going to put this big metal chair on top of this monument. So I think we can be happy that they ran out of funds. She wrote a series of letters to, I think Cole probably told her who he thought she should write to, and one was the manager of El Tovar, that would be Victor Petroso. And she wrote on the left, there can be but 2 possible reasons for the refusal to give me a room. Kindly explain which it was. And incidentally, it's not my fault if the hotel has a perfectly awful time getting its water, and if strange people wander around under the awe-inspiring notion that they own the canyon. And then she says, I have no desire to enter into a cheap quarrel, apparently a very expensive quarrel. But later she writes, so November, then December, for arrogance, bad breeding, and ill treatment, my reception at El Tovar beggars description. So she claims she was refused a room, and they sort of are saying, hey, we wanted to give you a room. So I don't know, she's upping the pressure on him. By the end of December, she's writing, if you suppose for one instant I intend to be refused a room during the off season without apology, you don't understand me. I'm giving a copy of this letter to 4 men of prominence, brains, and connected with the government, and also to 2 congressmen. So some of these guys are Stephen Mather, the director of the National Park Service, who quickly turfs it to his deputy, second in charge, Arno Kammerer, and says, figure this out. They contact the superintendent of Grand Canyon, that's Ross Eakin in the upper right, and Victor Petroso is the manager of El Tovar. Eakin tries to get her money back for the tour. She says, I don't want my money back. I just want to be treated right. And then the 2 senators, of course, are Ashurst and Cameron. Eventually, Eakin, I guess, manages to calm her down, and he apologizes and he says, if you come again, please let us know. We're going to make sure you have a great time. In a couple of years, she's going to Paris with the Women's Party on a trip. And I think that might be her. It looks like that same expression. They're not identified, however. Then she shows up in some social pages. She's living at the Carlton. It's now the St. Regis. She goes to Havana. That's even after the stock market crash, 1930. Looks like she went to Cuba twice anyway. This is 1931. And then I don't understand why her birth date's listed as September 10th. I think it's the 8th, but it's always listed as the 10th. Maybe her parents forgot. In 1941, she's back, and the photo is labeled Major's daughter with unknown male at Grand Canyon. Well, that looks a lot like Emery Kolb, and they're standing outside the studio next to the boat he went down the river in with his brother. She visited Zion and Bryce as well as the North Rim, and the Park Service had put together this trip, and they said that traveling in a few hours to the same country that her father took months to traverse. And I think, well, with those heels and dress, she didn't go down the Peruna Leap, but the Park Service was really proud that they had a lot of paved roads to these beautiful locations. By the mid-40s, the biographers of her father were looking for her, and they contacted the park. The superintendent, Bryant, had contacted the DC office, and they found out she was living at 144 B Street. And they also advised she evidently now goes under the name of Mary Dean Powell. Well, she never didn't go under that name, but there was some confusion because a niece had donated some items of Powell's to the Grand Canyon Museum. And for some reason, a lot of people thought that the Powells didn't have any children, and maybe there was only a niece. But she was living, it turns out, at the National Women's Party headquarters. They were renting rooms in this mansion, and it's now the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument since 2016. And you can earn your junior suffragist badge with that freedom pin on it. Mary was buried with her parents at Arlington National Cemetery. That's a cousin that was the informant for this interment. It says that the headstone was pending, but there was never any addition to the marker that's there. And so even when you do a search on the digital function at Arlington, her name never comes up. And lastly, we'll look at the niece. Maud Powell showed early proficiency in violin. She was born in Peru, Illinois. Whoops. Her mom was of Hungarian and German extraction. She went by Minnie, and her father went by Bram or Bramwell. He became superintendent of schools for the District of Columbia eventually. But at age 3, they moved to Aurora, Illinois, and she took the train into Chicago to study violin. And she outgrew her teachers there. They recommended she go study in Europe, and she auditioned and was accepted at a school in Leipzig, Germany, and then she studied in Paris with Charles Dankla. She credited him with being her best teacher. She traveled and performed concerts in England, and then went for a year in Berlin with this famous violinist. His name was Joachim. He was an acquaintance of Mendelssohn's. And the following year, age 17, she came back and gave her debut with the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, and it was attended by her parents, her brother, her aunt and uncle Powells, and her younger cousin Mary. She was engaged, it says, for a European tour with John Philip Sousa's band, and she ended up becoming engaged to this guy, Godfrey Sonny Turner, and they played 122 concerts in 28 cities. Wow. In about 3 months. Turner was the manager for the Sousa band in England, and he started managing her career as well. They married a couple years later. They're fooling around in this picture with her brother, Will. They have a new camera, and they're taking pictures in mirrors. They traveled a lot as he managed her career. They went to Hawaii and South Africa, concerts all over Europe, and they lived in England for a while before coming back and basing mostly in New York, but she traveled extensively and gave lots of concerts. And he devised this card for her. It said she has the arm of a man, the heart of a woman, and the head of an artist. She's the first musician to record for Victor Records in 1904. And that was very controversial because it was felt that this music should only be heard in person and only in exclusive orchestras and arrangements. But she felt strongly that everybody needed music education and music in your home. And this was a great way to have music in rural America. And her records were sold on the right for $1.25. Oh yeah, during her lifetime, she was more famous than her Uncle Wes. I did a search on Genealogy Bank for the last 10 years of her life. She had over 5,600 articles. And the last 10 years of John Wesley Powell's life, I think there were 60. Now, of course, there's millions of hits for him. And maybe just a little excerpt. Whoops, can I move this and get... She gave a lot of concerts for fundraisers, including this one for this famous statue that was in the Capitol for the Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony. She voted when New York State gave women the right to vote in the 1917 election. She did make it to the canyon to her uncle's monument, but it was later in 1918. It wasn't at the dedication. Remember, that was during the Spanish influenza outbreak and during the World War I. She wrote a lot. She wrote for Etude magazine, The American Girl. She said, love your instrument as yourself, but love your art more than either. Keep the fires of enthusiasm burning. Nothing was ever accomplished without faith and enthusiasm. She died young at age 52, probably of a heart attack. She had collapsed on stage the month before and couldn't finish her concert. And her ashes were scattered in New York. But her memories kept alive by young violinists and by the Maud Powell Society that's dedicated to music education. And they do a lot with encouraging young people. And she has a lot of accomplishments. She had a lot of diversity in her repertoire, and she broke ground for women musicians and did a lot of concerts for fundraisers. And she was given a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 2014. Her hometown of Peru, Illinois, built this nice statue for her, and they have an annual music festival. Dellenbaugh reminds us that the major and the professor repose at Arlington, and I would say along with 3 of the women as well, and that they should not be forgotten because of the great geographical problem that they solved. And I would argue that perhaps the women's contributions should be honored and remembered as well. And I thank you for helping shine some light on them tonight. Tom. Should I stop my screen share?
Yeah, that'd be great. And everyone should have the ability to unmute themselves now. That was a great presentation, Cindy. I've got a ton of questions, but I think maybe some others might as well. I'm gonna jump in though first and ask you, I got confused. Maud is related to
She's the niece of John Wesley Powell.
yes, but by who?
Bramwell, his brother.
Bramwell. Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you. And you mentioned that that both Nell and Emma, it sounded like they were nurses, or they certainly were skilled in nursing. Is that right?
They worked as nurses, but you know, a lot of people, it was kind of volunteer nursing. I don't think they had specific training, or maybe you would say on-the-job training. And a lot of family members provided nursing care for their loved ones because there just wasn't the staffing available.
So it wasn't like they had formal training, but
I don't think so.
But clearly, if you're around the Civil War and you're going to be a nurse, you're going to get some fast training in that. Yeah, fascinating. Okay, questions. Y'all are free to unmute yourselves if you'd like and shoot in for questions. I do notice that Terry Cleland mentioned that the Kaibab National Forest nominated Brow Monument to the National Register in the 1980s. She said it's fascinating to learn about this aspect of the exploration. So thank you, she says.
Good. Thank you, 17026.
You're too intimidating. No one wants to ask questions.
I probably can't answer them. So
I also found it just amazing that Mary Dean was so strong in the suffrage movement, and yet the biographers totally discounted that.
yeah, I think they didn't want to go too far afield, and maybe I don't know. It's easy now to do digital searching, but she is kind of behind the scenes in a sense. I mean, the Grand Canyon Museum collection, when I went for a talk there, they were showing us items and saying, oh yeah, Powell's niece donated this. And I said, didn't he have a kid? And they were like, no. And so I think she kind of just isn't really that well known. The superintendent's notes for 1941 barely mention her visit.
Wow.
The newspapers did better.
Under the radar.
I don't know if she came back between those visits either. Be interesting to know. And like, where did she stay in 1941? I tried to find that out, but you'd have to dig through the registry, and she could have stayed at Bright Angel, I guess, because she vowed never to stay at Altabar, but maybe she kissed and made up. I don't know.
I don't know. It's Kathy Ferretta's got a nice point here. It's very interesting. She may be shy and didn't want to be in the limelight of her father.
Yeah, and he kind of sucked all the oxygen, I mean, all the attention went to him, although I think the mother was pretty strong too, maybe was a performer even.
I was totally clueless about the chair that was supposed to be on the monument. What were they thinking?
Oh, I don't know. I love her comments about the monument, though. I think it's great. And about
Yes.
the person wandering around around the rim, thinking they own the canyon. She's kind of a little off the wall there and obsessive and wanting to explain more. And in some of those letters, she's starting at the beginning again to go blow by blow through everything. So really like to know about that nervous breakdown thing.
Yeah. And I love the deal about you take that beam out of your eye, Mr. President.
Yeah.
Just great.
Talk about social media, right? I mean, they were using the newspapers. They were really putting a lot of pressure on, but got a lot of blowback for that.
Of their day, and very cleverly, pointing out Canada and
The
just
monarchy. Yeah.
absolutely. Very, very well done. But years worth of work and going to jail. And can you show us? You have the little. Can you put that right up next to your camera?
What is it?
Your
the pin. My pin.
Yeah, your pin.
Can you see the pin?
No. Is it easy to take off?
Yeah.
If you
I have it on a chain, but
you should be able to move it right up to your camera.
oh, to my camera. Yeah.
Yeah, on your computer there.
Yeah. Like that?
Yeah. So it's a jail door.
A prison door, and the lock is a heart.
Oh.
Yeah, little chain.
And where can you get those?
The Ellis Paul Institute, and I noticed there's some other places that are selling them as well.
Oh, that's cool.
But I've worn it some, and people never ask about it, so I guess you can tell the story.
Yeah. But there it is. Well, any other questions?
Thanks very much.
Well,
Hey,
thank
Cindy,
you.
thank you.
Thanks, Shane.
Yep.
There is a question there from Kathy saying she agrees with Terry, and are you thinking of publishing?
Well, the Old Pioneer has a few articles I've written about these topics, like the 1916 visit to El Tovar. I wrote an article about Mary Dean Powell. I think those are the two that are published already. But yeah, I want to do other things. I'm not going to go dig deeper. I went to the Belmont Paul House and went through all the suffragist articles looking for Mary Dean Powell, and all I could find is that she was renting a room there. So I think, okay, I kicked a lot of stones. I found as much as I found more than I thought I would.
Yeah.
The Grand Canyon Symposium turned this paper down.
Kern says, yeah, this was rejected by, I started it at the 2019 because they were focusing on Powell. So I thought, well, I'll do a Powell women's thing, but it wasn't accepted. So yeah, so thanks for having me tonight.
Thank you so much for presenting. It's very, very lovely that you've done this. I've learned a terrible amount, and I'm really thankful for that. And Mark says he wants to thank Cindy for the articles in the Old Pioneer. Both were very fascinating.
Good. And there's, Bill Bishop, he said at the CNAB meeting, he goes, you always write off the wall stuff.
Well, off the wall stuff is great. I mean, the history,
History's off the wall, right?
history's fascinating, and the more we hear about it, the better it is. So thank you for doing that.
You're welcome. And did you want to do the next, who's up next? Is it Dennis Foster?
I do. I'm going to mention that a month from now, these virtual outings happen on the second Tuesday of the month, same time, same place on Zoom. It's the same login and password that you've used. And next month, Dennis Foster is going to present on an eclectic mix of matched Grand Canyon photographs. So with that, we will see you all next month. Thank you all so much for attending. And if you're not a member of the Historical Society, you too can do that. Cindy, thank you so much again for being here tonight, and everyone else. Kern, I won that bet. We'll talk later. Y'all have a good night.
Thanks.
Good night.
Bye-bye.